Hi, everyone. I'm Caroline Moon, and I run the financial operations practice here at Andreessen Horowitz, where I help with finance best practices for all of our portfolio companies. My background before I joined the firm was I was a CFO for a number of venture-backed companies, so I know what it's like to be on the company side of the equation. And today I'm here to talk to you about how to think about the finance function and when is the right time to have a finance team at your company. When it comes to building companies, I don't think anyone here questions the importance of starting out with product and engineering. And when you're ready to build your go-to-market engine to sell the product that you've built, adding sales and marketing. So typically what this would mean is companies would wait until the very last minute to build out HR and finance. But with the war on talent over the last several years, having a chief people officer pretty early in a company's life cycle has become really standard, which has left finance out in the cold. Finance now tends to be the last area that gets built out, but I would argue if you want to increase your chances of success, it should actually be one of the first. Let's start with our first case study. In this example, we have a company that raised almost $65 million in funding through its Series B. They were operating in a TAM that had hundreds of billions of dollars of opportunity, and they are experiencing consecutive years of triple-digit growth. The problem here is that the company had unsustainable unit economics. The large TAM had attracted lots of competitors, which created pricing pressures, and the switching costs for customers were really low, so the company's customer retention was quite bad, and so their LTV to CAC was upside down. And despite this, the company still expanded internationally and domestically and continued to grow its headcount to over 100 employees. So the unfortunate situation here is that 5 years after being founded, they couldn't convince investors to give them additional funding because of their unsustainable business model, and the company ended up getting wound down. Here, the fact is that a strong finance team would have understood that there were bad unit economics in play and helped the company course correct before it was too late and before they had to shut down completely. So at the core, a great finance team isn't about just doing the basics. And let's call those things payroll and tracking expenses and keeping track of the cash. They also do much more strategic things, like helping define and track the right KPIs to measure the business's progress, assess the company's finite resources, which are primarily people, products, and cash, and they figure out how to create enough time to get from one key milestone to the next. In this case, let's assume it's a successful next fundraise, while operating under a set of what are usually hard constraints, which is namely cash balance. There is another function at tech companies that does the exact same thing, only at the product level, that every founder would agree is a must-have at their company, and that's the product team. So Ben Horowitz has used an analogy in the past where he's likened HR to QA. To paraphrase him, in the same way that you wouldn't build a complex product without QA, you shouldn't build a complex organization without HR. I really like this analogy and think it's also extensible when likening finance to product. Ben has actually written a blog post also outlining the qualities of a great product manager, so I wanted to go over what those traits are. So a great product manager knows the market, the product, the customers, and the competition well, and operates from a strong basis of knowledge and confidence, focusing the team on revenue and customers. They also know the context going in, whether it's revenue or competition, and they take responsibility for devising and executing a winning product roadmap. They crisply define the target, the what versus the how, and manages the delivery of the what. They're also actually really good at decomposing problems and coming up with solutions, because more often than not, things don't go according to plan. All we have to do is replace the words product manager with finance team, and you can see what I mean. A strong product team takes its finite set of resources, namely time and a fixed number of engineers, and iteratively figures out how to deliver great products under those constraints. If the trains run early or late, they know how to rejigger everything to take those events into account, or strip a product down to an MVP if necessary. They're responsible for making sure products are performing to expectations, and when they don't, they figure out why and set a course of action to fix the issues. This is exactly the same thing a great finance team does, but at the company level. In the same way that complex products can really only be built with a strong product team and well-defined product roadmap, to build something complex like an entire company needs a finance team to manage the company roadmap, also known as an operating plan. This raises the chances of a company's success even with the limited resources it has. So let's look at our second case study. In this particular example, we have a company that had a very healthy two-sided marketplace, and they were experiencing strong growth. There was, I will note, no finance team and no operating plan. And in this particular situation, we had a company where they were paying their suppliers as soon as they fulfilled their obligations to their customers. And the reason why they did this was because they wanted to make sure that the suppliers were happy and they could retain them on their platform. The problem in this case is that the company didn't collect cash from their customers until 90 days later, so they ended up dipping into their own cash to pay their suppliers. What this ended up creating was a serious and unforeseen cash crunch, so they ended up burning through their cash about 12 months sooner than they were planning. So this created two problems for the company. The first was because they burned through their cash 12 months before they were planning, they weren't able to demonstrate the traction they wanted to show in their key KPIs, which would have then helped to have a really healthy fundraise. The second issue is that in order to be able to make it to the next fundraise, they ended up having to take a bridge loan, which caused some unnecessary dilution. So they basically ended up fundraising under a lot of duress, and the outcome wasn't as good as they had hoped. So the takeaway here is that a strong finance team would have seen the working capital issues well before they became a problem, and they would have worked with the business in order to figure out a good resolution between preserving their own cash and keeping their suppliers happy. A lot of people think that finance is just bookkeeping or reconciling the cash you have in the bank every month, and that's not actually finance. It's just a small piece of what we consider accounting. But before I go deeper into what finance actually is, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on accounting and how to think about it. Accounting is just a word that we use to talk about a manual ETL process of translating the money that flowed in and out of your company, whether it's revenue, contracts you signed, invoices you've paid for or have to pay, or payroll, and into a mineable financial data set. So the more importance you place on detailed capture on that data set, the better that data set is, the more mineable it is, the more backwards compatible it is for anything you want to do in the future. Everyone listening, I'm sure, is pretty maniacal about capturing every single thing you can think of in your product and transactional data sets, every move your customers make in your product, and every other possible interaction that you think is important to track. You're probably even logging things right now that you aren't sure are important, in case they are later. That mindset should be applied to your financial data as well. While it may seem like your company is too small or too simple to have to be that detail-oriented about your financial data, it's worth it now to code in the detail when it's easy versus what we normally see, which is when it's late in the game, it's a lot harder to set up, and in the meanwhile, you've lost all of that longitudinal data. Here's a simple example that I've liked to use a lot about good ETL versus bad ETL when it comes to your financial data set, and it has to do with trade shows and conferences. The majority of the time when a company spends money on this, it's related to sales and marketing, which is of course related to customer acquisition. But not always. You might be sending your developers to conferences they want to attend for employee education or morale reasons. There are things like Worldwide Developer Conference, Google I/O, Strata, and F8, and those conferences can sometimes cost thousands of dollars per person. So if you have an inexperienced bookkeeper or accountant, they're most likely going to lump all of the money you spent on conferences for that period into a single line item, which would then overstate your CAC because they're not tracking things in the right level of detail and they're not thinking strategically about how the data is going to be used. When you want to talk about key metrics like CAC, LTV, and sales efficiency, and any other kind of ratio like that, a bad accounting process will give you the wrong answers when it comes to your business. And worse, once it's in that data blob, it's impossible to parse. Basically, it's the classic GIGO problem, garbage in, garbage out. The more time and attention you take to accurately capture and code your financial data set means you'll have more historical context and insight into your business. And this means you'll be able to make better decisions. I can't emphasize enough that it's pretty much impossible to go back in time because it's just too expensive. And then the shame of it is that you can't talk about your historical KPIs in any meaningful way. And at the end of the day, investors want as much game film as possible on your business so they can feel confident enough to invest in your next round. So treat your financial information like the important data set that it is. Founder CEOs should be fluent in all aspects of their business, and financial fluency is just as core as anything else a CEO knows. Since their financials, and I don't mean just knowing cash burn, represent the state of their business and are something they should know like the back of their hand. Our last case study is a pretty classic one. This is a company that decided that things had picked up enough in the business to hire someone to do finance full-time. They didn't want to spend too much money on it, so they decided to hire a really junior accountant. The problem with this is that nobody had any idea whether this person was doing their job correctly once they hired them. And during the next fundraise, the due diligence process proved to be really painful, as it was obvious that the company's financials weren't detailed enough and the KPIs weren't granular enough. There were times during the due diligence where they weren't able to answer questions because they didn't have the data. And in other instances, they were able to answer questions, but it would take them weeks to get back to investors. After that less than ideal fundraise, the company decided to hire a senior leader to head their finance team. And this person spent the better part of a year fixing things that had happened before they gotten there, versus being able to be a much more strategic asset to the CEO. The better solution for the company would have been to use an outsourced CFO firm, which would in actuality have cost less than the inexpensive and ultimately expensive junior hire. So while in the short run, it felt like they were saving money, In reality, it ended up being a very expensive misstep. So the takeaway here is that skimping on key senior hires is penny wise, pound foolish. So now let's get back to what great finance is. A great finance team will be your right hand in running your company. They understand both the internal company and external competitive dynamics and will construct a detailed map that takes your strategy and turns it into an execution roadmap, or what we call an operating plan. Think of this as a company roadmap that's akin to a product roadmap. It ingests your company's variables and constraints, namely people, product, and cash, and creates a blueprint to get to your next milestone. And this is revised continuously as new information comes in, such as early or late product releases, stronger or weaker bookings results, or slower and faster hiring. It's very much like having an agile process running on top of the company at all times to make sure everything is moving in the right strategic direction. Not having a strong finance team is like flying an airplane with no windows and no navigation equipment. You're definitely in the air, but where are you and how are you going to get to where you want to go? And this applies to companies at any stage in their life cycle. So as far as structure goes, we recommend the following when it comes to hiring your finance team. While it's still early, call it pre-revenue to up to about $10 million in revenue. And as long as your business model is not complex, use an outsourced full-stack CFO firm. These firms are not to be confused with a simple bookkeeper, since a bookkeeper is just a shadow of what outsourced CFO firms can do for your company. And be sure to engage with a full-stack CFO firm whose executives and team members have deep operational expertise with venture-backed companies. Not all of these firms are created equal, so it's important to screen carefully. You want to work with a firm where the CFO wants to be deeply engaged with you. Once you get past about $10 million in revenue, you should think about bringing finance in-house. And you're looking at this point for a senior head of finance. And the nice thing here is that you have the luxury of time to look carefully because you already have that experienced outsourced full-stack finance team in place. With that said, there are two exceptions to this framework. The first is if your business model is relatively complicated, such as an inventory-based business, a marketplace, or if you've expanded into multiple locations, particularly internationally. In these cases, you should bring in your senior leader of finance sooner rather than later, given the many moving parts. It's important to get a strong in-house finance team in place as soon as possible. The second exception to this framework is if you hire a VP of sales. At this point, you need to bring in a senior head of finance. This is because you're getting ready to spend a lot of money to get your go-to-market motion going, and you have to get the right structure and oversight in place to handle the increased burn and the added risk. To give you some more context, a VP of sales generally takes on average 6 to 12 months to ramp. And if along the way you realize you made the wrong hire, it takes 3 to 6 months to find a new VP of sales. And then this new VP of sales will take 6 to 12 months to ramp. So all told, you're looking at having lost potentially 18 to 24 months of runway if you don't have the appropriate financial oversight in place. The biggest reason I hear from founders why they don't want to hire an outsourced finance team is that they think it's expensive or it's too early. Now that we've hopefully covered the reasons why it's never too early to hire a finance team, let's focus on what it actually costs if you use an outsourced team. It turns out that straightforward seed stage companies probably only need about 1 to 2 days a week from their outsourced finance team, which works out to between $1,000 to $5,000 a month. As you scale to $10 to $20 million in annual revenue, you can expect to spend about $10,000 to $20,000 a month, since you're probably at this point relying on your outsourced team almost full time. If that sounds expensive to you, let's put it in perspective. A seed stage company spending $2,000 a month is spending $24,000 a year on their interim finance team. And at $24,000 a year, that's almost the equivalent of hiring someone full-time for minimum wage in San Francisco. And for that, you get an entire finance team. And even at the upper end of the range at $20,000 a month, you're only spending $240,000 a year, which is about the cost of a single senior executive, which is a screaming steal considering at this point, you're using the outsourced team practically full-time. And this outsourced team consists of CFO, controller, FP&A analyst, all the way down to the AP clerk. So you've got an entire full stack finance team working for you for a fraction of what it would cost if you had it in-house. Every company should set the stage right from the beginning to give them the most optionality as possible. Not only will you form the right foundation from day one in correctly coding your financial data set along with all the necessary compliance, but you'll be giving yourselves a better shot at success. You'll always have a read on how your business is performing through establishing an operating plan and constantly measuring yourself against what you expect to accomplish, including establishing and monitoring your KPIs on a real-time basis in order to achieve your next set of key milestones or course correct as soon as possible. You'll also always be due diligence ready, and you'll have a partner to help communicate effectively to the board and potential investors. It also allows you the space to make the right resourcing decisions. Because you'll have your outsourced team managing the finance function, when you're ready to build finance in-house, you'll have the luxury of time to look for the right senior hire, whether it's a VP of finance or CFO, who can then strategically build out the team, leveraging the outsourced CFO firm, and then gracefully transitioning them out. So how should you recruit for this outsourced finance role? The key, just like any hire, is to make sure you like the outsourced CFO you're hiring. You should absolutely assess them with the same lens you would use for a full-time hire, because the fact is they're going to be a key part of the team, only just for 1 to 2 days a week. They should be someone that you would enjoy working with and can trust. Otherwise, the partnership's going to fail no matter how skilled they are. So ask yourself, is this someone I want sitting at the table with us during our exec staff meetings? Because they should definitely be attending those so they always know the context. Is this person someone I trust to keep an eye on all of the company's resources and whether we're accomplishing our milestones? And then you should expect the CFO to come in at least once a week, preferably the day that you have your exec staff meeting, while the rest of the team comes in as needed to take care of the day-to-day financial operations, whether it's KPI reporting, running payroll, reconciling expenses, or collecting revenue. So to recap, finance is an important function to get right from the beginning, not to leave for later or when your business is complicated. Bad things can happen to good companies because they don't have a finance team, including going out of business. Treat your financial data set as something that's just as important as your customer and transactional data set, because it is and ultimately needs to be married to all of your other data in order to do any kind of meaningful KPI analyses. Having a strong finance team, whether it's outsourced or in-house, will give you continuous visibility into the health of your business and increases your chance of successfully reaching your next key milestone. And you can do it right without breaking the bank. Basically, for the cost of one junior full-time position, you can get an entire outsourced finance team from the CFO to the controller to the FP&A analyst, all the way down to the AP clerk. So the full stack for a fraction of the cost. And when it's time to hire your first in-house finance person, make sure it's a pretty senior position like a VP of finance or CFO, as you want to build your organization correctly from the ground up, and the head of that team should be the first hire and not the last. Thanks very much.